Hey, what is up everyone? Today we got a pretty unique story. It's narrated by Frederick Surrey. Get cozy and watch till the end, guys.
In the beginning, before the first human drew breath, before the Eldar walked among the stars, before even the Old Ones shaped the younger races to their will, there existed something else. Something that predates memory itself. Something that watched the universe ignite from primordial darkness and felt the first stars burn with an awareness that nothing living could comprehend. These beings are known by many names across the galaxy. The Eldar call them Ingir, speaking the word with a reverence reserved for nightmares made flesh. But to those who first encountered them, to the desperate and dying Necrontyr, who reached out into the void seeking salvation, they were the Satan, the star gods, the devourers of suns. This is their story. A tale that spans 60 million years and reaches back to the very moment of creation. And it is a story of hunger that knows no satisfaction, of power that warps reality itself, of a betrayal so profound that it shattered gods and doomed entire species to a fate worse than extinction. The Satan are not merely ancient, they are primordial. They are the oldest intelligences in the Milky Way galaxy and perhaps beyond. And though they have been broken, imprisoned, scattered into countless fragments across the stars, they remain, waiting, dreaming, hungering for the feast that was stolen from them. To understand the Satan, you must first abandon your conception of what it means to be alive. They are not biological. They do not reproduce, do not evolve, do not age in any way that mortal minds can grasp. They simply are, and have been, since the moment the universe exploded into existence. When the Big Bang tore through the fabric of nothing and created everything, the Satan were born from that cosmic violence. They coalesced from the swirling energies, taking form as vast, sentient entities of pure electromagnetic force. In those early epochs, they were not truly conscious in any way we would recognize. They were more akin to natural phenomena, living storms of energy that drifted through the newborn cosmos, drawn inexorably toward the furnaces of creation that dotted the darkness. The stars. Those brilliant points of fusion and fire became the Satan's natural habitat. They would spread themselves across the surface of a sun, their vast forms drinking deeply from the nuclear reactions that powered these cosmic engines. For billions of years, this was their existence. An endless, mindless consumption of stellar energy, moving from star to star as each was drained to a dying ember. They learned to create wings from the electromagnetic fields that permeate space, diaphanous constructs that allowed them to ride the cosmic winds between distant suns. They were, in their own way, beautiful, terrible, and utterly inhuman, but possessed of a majestic horror that would have taken the breath from any who could have witnessed them in those ancient times. But they were not aware, not truly. They fed as a fire consumes fuel, without thought or purpose or desire beyond the simple imperative to continue existing. They had no concept of other beings, no understanding that there might be forms of life different from themselves. The universe was their feeding ground and nothing more. For countless eons, this was enough. The Satan drifted through space, as eternal and unchanging, consuming stars and moving on, a fundamental part of the cosmos no different from gravity or radiation. They might have remained that way forever, mindless energies performing an endless cosmic dance, if not for a single desperate species reaching out across the void in search of salvation, the Necrontyr. Even speaking their name now carries the weight of tragedy. They were a people born under a cruel star, their homeworld orbiting a sun that bathed them in lethal radiation from the moment their species first crawled from their planet's oceans. Every generation was marked by the same bitter curse: short lives, riddled with cancers and mutations, bodies that decayed even as they grew. The Necrontyr were a brilliant people, possessed of scientific and technological prowess that allowed them to reach for the stars despite their ailing flesh. But brilliance could not cure what ailed them. No amount of advancement could heal the fundamental sickness that their son had written into their very genes. They looked out at the galaxy and saw the Old Ones, that ancient and enigmatic race who had mastered the secret of immortality, who lived for millennia while the Necrontyr struggled to survive mere decades. The inequality gnawed at them. Why should the Old Ones live forever while they suffered and died? They begged for the secret, but the Old Ones refused. Whether from wisdom or cruelty, the Ancient Ones would not share their gift. And so the Necrontyr went to war. The war in heaven, they would call it. A conflict fought across the stars, as with weapons that could shatter planets and fleets that darkened the void. But for all their technology, the Necrontyr were outmatched. The Old Ones commanded the webway, those impossible tunnels through reality that allowed them to strike anywhere and retreat before the Necrontyr could respond. They wielded psychic powers that the Necrontyr, soulless as they were becoming in their bitterness, could not counter. Generation after generation fell in battle. Whole dynasties were extinguished. The unity that the Necrontyr had briefly achieved through their shared hatred began to fracture once more as different factions blamed each other for their failures. They were losing. Slowly, but inevitably, they were being pushed back to their radiation-scarred homeworlds to die forgotten in the outer darkness. In their desperation, they looked to the stars for answers. Not the metaphorical stars of hope or destiny, but the literal burning orbs that hung in their skies. They had always studied suns, seeking to understand the radiation that cursed them, searching for some way to turn their greatest weakness into strength. And in that study, they made a discovery that would change the galaxy forever. There was something in the stars, something alive. Through their instruments and observations, the Necrontyr detected vast patterns of energy that could not be explained by simple physics. These were not random fluctuations or natural phenomena. They were too regular, too purposeful. Something was feeding on the stellar fires, draining them in ways that suggested intelligence, or at least something approaching it. The archives of Solemnas would later claim this discovery was accidental, a chance detection made by a stellar probe investigating a dying star. But the Eldar have a different account, recorded in their Book of Mournful Night. They claim that the raw hatred the Necrontyr felt for the Old Ones sang out across space like a beacon, calling to beings that fed on such dark emotions. Perhaps both accounts are true in their own way. Perhaps it was destiny, or merely the cruel indifference of an uncaring universe bringing predator and prey together at last. The first contact was made with a Citan that fed upon the very star around which the Necrontyr homeworld orbited. They called it a Zagorod, the Nightbringer. It was born from their sun, had always been there, drinking the radiation that poisoned them. In a sense, as the Nightbringer was responsible for every short life, every painful death, every cancer-riddled corpse that had marked the Necrontyr's entire existence. When they reached out to it across what they termed an incorporeal starlight bridge, using technologies that even now are not fully understood, the Nightbringer responded. And in responding, it awakened. For the first time in its billions of years of existence, the Nightbringer became truly aware. The electromagnetic bridge the Necrontyr created gave it something it had never possessed before, a connection to material reality, a way to interact with solid matter rather than simply existing as diffuse energy. But more than that, it gave the Nightbringer its first taste of something new. The Necrontyr had constructed a body for it, fashioned from necrodermis, a living metal that could contain and channel the vast energies of a star god. When the Nightbringer poured itself into that form, compressing thousands of miles of energy being into a comparatively tiny humanoid shape, something fundamental changed. It became aware of itself as a distinct entity. It developed what could only be called consciousness, and with consciousness came hunger. Not the mindless consumption of stellar energy it had always known, but a new and terrible craving. The Nightbringer looked upon the Necrontyr who had summoned it, these fragile beings of flesh and electricity, and it tasted something it had never experienced before: fear, awe, worship, and it found that these emotions were more intoxicating than any star it had ever consumed. The Nightbringer slaughtered those who had brought it into being. Not all of them, but enough to savor this new delicacy. The life force of mortal beings, their terror and suffering as they died, tasted sweeter than any stellar fire. It learned then that there was a whole galaxy full of such creatures, billions upon billions of lives waiting to be consumed. Only through desperate pledges of servitude did the remaining Necrontyr convince the Nightbringer to spare them. They promised to show it where other species could be found, whole civilizations ripe for harvest. They would worship it, serve it, help it feed on all the life in the galaxy, if it would only spare them and help them defeat their enemies, the Old Ones. The Nightbringer agreed, but it was not alone. Once the Necrontyr understood that these star gods could be awakened and given form, they sought out others. They found Mephetran, whom they called the Messenger, but who was known to his own kind as the Deceiver. Unlike the Nightbringer, the Deceiver was one of the weaker Citan, and it gained power through cunning rather than raw strength. It accumulated followers and devotees, learning to manipulate and scheme, using honeyed words and false promises to secure its future. The Deceiver told the Necrontyr that the Citan and Old Ones had fought before, long before the Necrontyr even existed, and that the Citan had been defeated. But united with the Necrontyr, they could win this time. They could feast on all the life in the galaxy and achieve total dominion over the material realm. One by one, the Necrontyr awakened more Citan. Each one craved worshippers and slaves to satisfy their monstrous egos. Though many of these servants soon descended into murderous insanity, brought on by the presence of the star gods. The Nightbringer's followers, in particular, were plagued by horrifying visions of death and bloodshed that drove them mad. But for all the cost, the Citan provided the Necrontyr with something they desperately needed: gods who would fight on their side, beings of such immense power that even the Old Ones might be challenged. Yet the Citan wanted more than worship. They wanted the Necrontyr themselves, and so they offered a gift: a path to immortality, to physical stability, to bodies that would never decay or sicken. The Citan promised that the weak flesh of the Necrontyr would be replaced with the same living metal that made up the star god's own forms. Their discarded organic husks would be consumed, and their consciousnesses would be transferred into cold, immortal shells of necrodermis. Zarek, the silent king of the Necrontyr and leader of the Triarch, faced an impossible choice. His people were dying, fractured, on the verge of extinction. The war in heaven was going poorly. The promise of immortality, of freedom from the curse that had defined their entire existence, seemed like the answer to prayers they had screamed at an uncaring universe for millennia. After months of debate, the Triarch approved the plan. Not all dynasties went willingly. Some, like those led by Trazyn the Infinite and Orican the Diviner, had to be forced. But willing or not, they all marched into the biofurnaces. The Silent King had sealed the pact, and there would be no turning back. The biotransference process was a nightmare made manifest. Vast biofoundries were constructed across the Necrontyr Empire, great machines of incomprehensible complexity that would strip away flesh and soul and replace them with cold metal and ghostly echoes. The exact procedures used within those raging furnaces cannot be fully known, lost to the mists of 60 million years. But we know this: each Necrontyr was stripped of their flesh, their consciousness ripped from dying organic matter and forced into shells of living metal. And as they underwent this transformation, as millions upon millions of Necrontyr marched into the fires, the Citan swarmed above the biofoundries, their ethereal true forms diving and swooping, glutting themselves on the spiritual and electromagnetic detritus of an entire species. They feasted on the souls of the Necrontyr, every single one. The rich tapestry of individual consciousness, the hopes and dreams and memories that made each Necrontyr unique, all of it was consumed by the hungering gods. What emerged from the biofurnaces were not the immortal beings the Necrontyr had hoped to become. They were hollowed-out automata, soulless machines, animated by what remained of their guttering selves. The vast majority of the population had their individuality and emotions completely erased, reduced to mindless warriors that would later be known simply as Necron warriors. Professional soldiers became immortals, allowed a little independence to better serve their masters. Only the ruling elite, the overlords and cryptex and high nobility were granted enough complexity in their new forms to retain something approaching sentience. But even for these fortunate few, well, the price was terrible. Sarek himself was given the most sophisticated Necron body of all, with a sensory and neurological network far superior to anything flesh could create. He retained his full personality and consciousness, along with command protocols that gave him absolute control over every other Necron. It should have been a triumph. The Necrontyr had achieved immortality. They were stronger, more durable, freed from pain and sickness and death. But as Zarek emerged from the biotransference process and looked upon what had become of his people, he felt an emptiness gnawing at his mind, an inexpressible hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. In that moment, with cold certainty, he knew that the price of physical immortality had been the loss of their souls. The Necrontyr were not transformed, they were dead, and the Necrons had been born from their corpses. The Satan had deceived them utterly. The immortality they promised was a half-truth wrapped in malice. Yes, the Necrons would live forever, but it was a mockery of life, an existence without joy or sorrow, without the capacity to feel or dream or hope. They were unified now, but only because command protocols had been embedded in every Necron mind, granting Sarek unwavering loyalty through technological enslavement rather than any genuine consent. The Silent King embraced this unanimity at first, grateful for any reprieve from the chaos that had consumed the Necrontyr Empire in recent years. But even as he did so, he was planning for vengeance against the beings who had tricked him into damning his entire species. But first, there was a war to win. Armed with weapons of godlike power and starships that could cross the galaxy in the blink of an eye through quantum phase technology, the Necrons stood ready to begin their war against the Old Ones anew. And this time, they had the Satan fighting at their side. The star gods reveled in the war, for it gave them endless opportunities to feed. They discovered that they could consume not just individual life forces, but entire populations, entire worlds. The Red Harvests began, campaigns of systematic genocide that saw millions upon millions of beings slaughtered to sate the hunger of the Satan. Planets were razed, suns were extinguished, snuffed out like candles as the Satan drained them of every last drop of energy. Or whole star systems were devoured by artificial black holes, summoned into being by the reality-warping powers of the star gods. The Nightbringer proved itself the most terrible of all the Satan in battle. Its love of pain and death was monumental, a living god of suffering and despair. When it strode across the battlefields of the war in heaven, its very presence imprinted itself upon the psyche of every sapient species that witnessed it. The concept of death as a hooded figure with a scythe, the Grim Reaper himself, was burned into the collective unconscious of every race that came into existence after the Nightbringer revealed itself. Even species that evolved millions of years after the war in heaven ended carry that primal fear of the Nightbringer's form in their deepest instincts. It craved worshippers. But those who served it directly descended into murderous insanity, unable to withstand the bloody visions its presence induced. The Nightbringer cared little. It had learned to revel in the act of consumption itself, throwing itself at the Old One's forces with abandon, feeding on souls with an appetite that could never be satisfied. The Deceiver took a different approach. While physically one of the weaker Satan, it compensated with guile and manipulation. Mephetran accumulated followers through persuasion rather than raw power, even sending some of its slaves to serve other Satan to curry favor and position itself favorably among the star gods. The Deceiver was patient, always thinking several moves ahead, planting seeds that would bear fruit millennia hence. It whispered in ears, sowed discord, and turned allies against each other with honeyed words and subtle insinuations. The deceiver understood something that the other Catan did not, that power came not just from strength, but from controlling those who possess strength. And then there was Magladroth, the Void Dragon, said to be the greatest and most terrible of all the Catan. The Eldar called it a figure of oblivion, wanton destruction, and devastation. It was a master of the material realm, and its warriors were described as practically invincible. The Void Dragon could channel energies in ways that made it seem to be in command of the very laws of physics themselves. Where the Nightbringer brought fear and death, and the Deceiver brought manipulation and betrayal, the Void Dragon brought annihilation on a scale that defied comprehension. As in the accounts that survive from the war in heaven, the Void Dragon is consistently portrayed as the most powerful of the star gods, a being whose capabilities dwarfed even the considerable abilities of its kindred. There were others. Igrania, the World Shaper, whose very thoughts could break apart a planet and reshape it in forms more pleasing to its alien sensibilities. Niadrazatha, the Burning One, whose touch could set entire atmospheres ablaze and reduce armies to ash in moments. Iashudra, the Endless Swarm, described in later accounts as the most reviled of all the Catan for reasons lost to time. Each star god brought their own particular brand of horror to the war in heaven. Each found their own preferred methods of feeding and destruction. Together, they and the Necrons formed an alliance that seemed unstoppable. The Old Ones and their created races, the Eldar, the Krork, the Jokairo, and many others now lost to history, fought desperately against this onslaught. They wielded the power of the warp, drawing upon psychic energies that were anathema to the Satan. For beings of pure material reality, the Imperium was the one thing they could neither comprehend nor control. It was a realm of thought and emotion given form, governed by rules that had nothing to do with physics or logic. The Satan hated it with a passion that bordered on existential dread. They could not enter it, could not manipulate it, could barely even perceive it except as an absence, a hole in reality where their powers failed to reach. Despite this weakness, the sheer power the Satan brought to bear was overwhelming. The Old One's mastery of the webway became less effective as the Necrons learned to breach those interdimensional tunnels, bursting into the supposedly safe passages and slaughtering everything they found there. The Satan's arcane science proved a match for the Old One's warp-spawned magics, and gradually, inexorably, the tide of war turned. The Old Ones grew desperate. They unleashed powers that destabilized the warp itself, flooding it with the anguish and death of countless species. The once calm Sea of Souls became a roiling nightmare as older warp entities transformed into terrifying predators, feeding on the carnage of the war in heaven. But even this was not enough. The Necron legions breached the webway's inner sanctums. The Old Ones, those ancient beings who had shaped so much of the galaxy, who had nurtured the younger races and opposed entropy itself, were scattered and broken. Some fled into the depths of the webway and were never seen again. Others died defending their last strongholds. A few may have escaped to other galaxies, though this is speculation at best. What is certain is that by the end of the war in heaven, the Old Ones were no more. Their empire of knowledge and wisdom was shattered, their carefully cultivated younger races left to fend for themselves in a galaxy consumed by madness and death. The Satan stood at the apex of power. They had won. The galaxy was theirs to reshape as they saw fit. But victory brought with it a new problem. There was nothing left to conquer, and the red harvests had grown thin. The Satan had consumed so much of the galaxy's life that whole regions of space had become barren, devoid of the succulent morsels of fear and suffering that they craved. And so, inevitably, they turned upon each other. The deceiver, always the schemer, whispered to the Nightbringer that the essence of other Satan would taste far more exquisite than any mortal soul. After all, what could be more satisfying than consuming the concentrated power of a fellow god. The Nightbringer, driven by its insatiable hunger, believed the lie. It fell upon weaker Satan and devoured them, growing ever more powerful as it did so. Other star gods followed suit, either convinced by the deceiver's words or simply recognizing an opportunity when they saw one. The Satan civil war was brief but catastrophic, with godlike beings tearing into each other in battles that shattered worlds and extinguished stars. Some Satan were destroyed entirely, and others were diminished, their power drained by stronger kindred. According to some accounts, the deceiver even convinced Tegorach, the Eldar laughing god, to trick one Catan, Saranoga, the outsider, into consuming its own kind. The outsider, driven mad by what it had done, fled to the edges of the galaxy and beyond, hiding itself away in shame and insanity. Whether it still exists in some distant corner of the universe, whole and terrible in its madness, or whether it has fractured like the others, remains unknown. As the Satan fought amongst themselves, Zarek saw his opportunity. The Silent King had been waiting for this moment since the day he emerged from the biotransference furnaces and realized the depth of the Satan's betrayal. He had fought the entire war in heaven at their side, and never revealing the hatred that burned in what remained of his heart. He had watched his people become soulless automata, had felt the emptiness where his own spirit should have been, and he had planned. Now, with the Satan weakened by internal strife, exhausted from their cannibalistic feeding frenzy, the time had come for vengeance. The Necrons rose in revolt, armed with weapons that focused the unimaginable energies of the living universe. Technologies specifically designed to harm beings that existed as much as living energy as physical matter. They turned upon their former masters. The Satan, arrogant in their power and distracted by their own infighting, did not realize their danger until it was too late. The Necrons shattered the star gods, not destroyed them, for the Satan were beings of such fundamental power that true annihilation was beyond even Necron capabilities, but broke them into countless shards, fragments of their former selves that retained only pieces of the vast intelligences they had once been. The shattering was not uniform. Landugor, the Flayer, fought with such ferocity that the Necrons were forced to obliterate it completely. But in its death throes, the Flayer cursed the Necrons with what would become known as the Flayer virus, a degenerative condition that would cause some Necrons to devolve into nightmarish ghouls who butcher indiscriminately and drape themselves in the flayed skin of their victims. It was a final act of spite from a dying god, and it ensured that even in complete destruction, the Flayer would haunt the Necrons forever. Most of the other Satan were broken into shards and imprisoned within multidimensional prisons called tesseract labyrinths, geometric impossibilities that existed partially outside normal space-time. Within these prisons, individual Catan shards could be contained and controlled, their vast powers reduced to manageable levels and turned into weapons to be wielded by Necron overlords. But the process was imperfect. Each shard retained fragments of the original Citan's personality and power, but they were incomplete, confused beings that lacked full memory of what they had once been. They knew they had been greater, could feel the absence of their former glory like a phantom limb, but the details eluded them. This incompleteness made them erratic and dangerous, prone to eccentric behavior and unpredictable displays of power. A Satan shard might have the Nightbringer's love of death but lack its cunning, or possess the deceiver's manipulative nature without its strategic brilliance. They were mad gods, broken into pieces that dreamed of wholeness they could never achieve. The Necrons had won their freedom, but at terrible cost. The galaxy lay in ruins around them. The old ones were destroyed. The Eldar and other younger races were growing in power, their populations swelling to fill the void left by the war in heaven's casualties. The Necrons, exhausted by millions of years of conflict, could not stand against these rising powers. Not yet. Zarek made the decision to withdraw. He ordered the Necrons to retreat to tomb worlds scattered across the galaxy, there to enter a state of hibernation that would last 60 million years. In that time, he reasoned, and the younger races would mature and decline, weakened by internal conflicts and the passage of ages. When the Necrons awakened, they would find a galaxy ripe for conquest, populated by civilizations that had forgotten the horrors of the war in heaven. Before entering the Great Sleep himself, Zarek destroyed the command protocols that bound all Necrons to his will. It was an act of penance, a recognition that he had led his people to damnation and that they deserved the freedom to chart their own course when they eventually awoke. Then the Silent King took his personal dynasty, loaded them into massive stasis crypts aboard planet-sized sepulchral engines, and departed for the intergalactic void. He would not sleep with his people, but would instead wander the darkness between galaxies, alone with his guilt and grief, the only Necron who still remembered what it felt like to be truly alive. The C'tan Shards remained imprisoned in their tesseract labyrinths, stored in the depths of tomb worlds or carried as weapons by Necron overlords who understood their terrible value. For 60 million years they slumbered and dreamed, their consciousness diminished but not extinguished. And in those dreams they remembered, not clearly, not comprehensively, but enough to fuel an eternal hunger for the power that had been stripped from them. Each shard dreamed of reunion, of finding the other pieces of itself scattered across the galaxy and merging back into something approaching their original form. When the Necrons began to awaken in the late 41st millennium, they brought their C'tan shards with them. Yet these fragments of godhood became weapons of last resort, tools to be deployed when conventional forces proved insufficient. The shards are kept contained within tesseract vaults when they grow too powerful. Transcendent shards formed from dozens or even hundreds of lesser fragments, beings of such immense power that standard tesseract labyrinths cannot hold them. These transcendent shards are particularly dangerous, as they possess enough awareness to actively call out to other shards of the same C'tan, attempting to draw them together for reunion. A tesseract vault is a monolithic construct, a near indestructible prison and power source combined. At its heart, a transcendent C'tan shard writhes and rages against its bonds. The vault's walls exist partially outside normal space-time, in making them incredibly difficult to breach from either side. Canoptech leeches work constantly to maintain the dimensional barriers, while a Canoptech sentinel at the vault's center controls the imprisoned god through force shields and energy shackles.
You know, I have to pause here for a second because this part of the lore genuinely gives me chills every single time I revisit it. The idea that Necrontyr were so desperate, so consumed by their hatred and their suffering that they literally sold their souls to beings they barely understood. It's tragic in a way that most 40k lore doesn't quite capture. Like, we talk about grimdark all the time in this universe, but the C'tan story is different. It's not just darkness for darkness' sake, it's about what happens when you're so desperate for salvation that you can't see the trap being laid right in front of you. Zarek thought he was saving his people. He genuinely believed he was making the right choice, and that's what makes it so horrifying. Not that he was evil, but that he was trying to do good and damned an entire species because of it. But anyways, let's get back to how this nightmare actually unfolds.
The Sentinel draws power from the C'tan itself, using the god's own strength to maintain its prison. A cruelly ironic arrangement that the C'tan undoubtedly appreciate in the way one might appreciate being locked in a room where the key is your own severed hand. When a Tesseract Vault is deployed in battle, it can unleash devastating attacks. The C'tan Shard within can age foes to dust with temporal manipulation, set entire armies ablaze with reality-warping fire, or trigger earthquakes that crack open the ground beneath enemy positions. These are only the mildest expressions of their power, but carefully controlled and directed by the Vault systems. The full capabilities of even a diminished C'tan Shard are difficult to comprehend, as they operate according to laws of physics that have more to do with their fundamental nature as reality-warping beings than with standard scientific principles. Individual shards exhibit a wide range of abilities based on which C'tan they're fragments of, and which aspects of that C'tan's personality and power they retained. A shard of the Nightbringer might project waves of death energy, causing enemies to age and wither in seconds. Its gaze alone can induce heart attacks and system failures, stopping life with the same casual ease that one might extinguish a candle. The Nightbringer shards remember, in their fragmented way, what it felt like to feast on entire species' fear of death. That memory drives them to recreate that exquisite terror whenever they're released from their prisons. Shards of the Deceiver are perhaps the most dangerous in their way, for they retain that Satan's cunning and manipulative nature. These fragments can create illusions so perfect they fool even advanced scanning equipment. They can teleport across the battlefield, appearing behind enemy lines or vanishing from impossible situations. A Deceiver shard might manipulate time itself, rewinding moments to avoid attacks or accelerating its own movements to inhuman speeds. But more than physical tricks, Deceiver shards excel at psychological warfare. They whisper lies that sound like truth, plant suspicions that grow into paranoia, turn allies against each other with carefully chosen words. Some Deceiver shards have even escaped their prisons and gone on to manipulate entire sectors of the galaxy toward unknowable ends. The Void Dragon's shards demonstrate mastery over technology and the material realm itself. They can control machines with a thought, turning an enemy's weapons against them or causing sophisticated equipment to catastrophically malfunction. Some tech priests of the Adeptus Mechanicus have theorized that the Void Dragon's influence extends to the concept of the machine spirit itself, that every piece of technology in the galaxy carries a faint echo of the Void Dragon's consciousness. When a shard of Magladroth is released, nearby technology begins to behave erratically, as if responding to the presence of something it recognizes as a master or creator. And this brings us to perhaps the most disturbing implication of the Satan's existence in the current era, the Dragon of Mars. Deep beneath the surface of the Mechanicus's holy world, in the lightless depths of the Noctis Labyrinthus, something waits. According to accounts that date back to before the Age of Strife, the Emperor of Mankind fought a terrible battle against a dragon on ancient Terra. The legends describe it as both crawling beast with scythe-blade talons and loathsome bird, with an immense scaled head and a tail 20 meters long. Its scales were silver, harder than steel, yet rippling like liquid mercury when struck. The light of devoured stars shone in its breast. The Emperor, described in this account as a knight in golden armor riding a midnight black charger, had fought the dragon for days before finally finding a weakness beneath its left wing. He thrust his sword into that vulnerable spot and bound the creature with his banner, though he claimed he could not destroy it completely. Whether this tale describes a literal battle or an allegorical one is unclear. What is known is that at some point between that ancient conflict and the Age of Strife, the Emperor brought the dragon to Mars and imprisoned it in the Noctis Labyrinthus. The entity has remained there for millennia, its presence affecting the inhabitants of Mars in subtle and profound ways. According to some accounts, the dragon's dreams influenced the development of the first machines on Mars, inspiring the technological innovations that would eventually lead to the creation of the Adeptus Mechanicus. The Guardians of the Dragon, as a secretive order of individuals chosen by the Emperor and granted vastly extended lifespans, maintain the bindings that keep the creature imprisoned. They can share its memories, experiencing fragments of the dragon's thoughts and dreams, though the veracity of these visions is questionable at best. The description of the Dragon of Mars matches almost perfectly with what we know of the Satan, and specifically with the Void Dragon. It came from space, from between the stars. It possesses scales like liquid metal, necrodermis. It has devoured stars. All of these are hallmarks of the Satan. The Necrons certainly believe something important is imprisoned on Mars. In 998.M41, 5 Necron Shroud-class light cruisers conducted what can only be described as a suicide run through the Sol System's defenses, penetrating all the way to Mars itself. They landed near the Noctis Labyrinthus before being destroyed, their objective unknown, but presumably related to whatever sleeps beneath the red planet's surface. If the Dragon of Mars truly is a shard of the Void Dragon, or worse, a substantial portion of that most powerful Catan, then the implications are staggering. The entire Adeptus Mechanicus, the organization responsible for maintaining and producing the Imperium's technology, may unknowingly worship a fragment of one of the galaxy's most ancient and terrible entities. Every prayer to the Omnissiah, every ritual performed over blessed machinery, every invocation of the machine spirit might be feeding power to an imprisoned god. And if that god were to awaken, if the bindings the Emperor placed were to fail or be deliberately broken, the consequences would be catastrophic. The Void Dragon's mastery over technology could potentially allow it to control every machine in the Imperium simultaneously. Weapons would turn on their wielders. Ships would fire on their own fleets. The life support systems maintaining the Emperor's golden throne might fail with a single thought from the awakened god. It would be the return of the Men of Iron, but magnified 1,000-fold. Every piece of technology in human space suddenly animated by a malevolent intelligence that sees organic life as little more than fuel to be consumed. This is the nightmare that haunts those few individuals who know or suspect the truth about Mars. The Guardians of the Dragon work tirelessly to maintain the prison, knowing that any failure on their part could doom not just the Adeptus Mechanicus, but potentially all of humanity. The bindings must hold. The dragon must remain asleep. Because if it awakens, if even this one substantial shard of a Citan breaks free and regains its full awareness, the galaxy will burn. But Mars is not the only place where Citan shards pose a threat. Across the galaxy, free shards wander, having escaped or been released from their prisons. Some are relatively weak fragments, little more than mindless monsters that lash out at anything they encounter. Others are frighteningly intelligent, planning and scheming across centuries to achieve goals only they understand. The shard of the Nightbringer that appeared on Pavonis nearly destroyed an entire hive world before being stopped by the Ultramarines. Another Nightbringer shard appeared on Sycorax during the Indomitus Crusade, requiring the combined might of the Imperial Guard, Adeptus Mechanicus, and Legio Astorum to defeat. Shards of the Deceiver are particularly troublesome, as they often work toward long-term goals that only become apparent after the damage is done. One Deceiver shard manipulated members of the Alpha Legion into constructing a series of anti-warp pylons within the galactic core, a project that would take centuries to complete and whose ultimate purpose remains unknown. Another instigated the Gothic War, orchestrating events to ensure the destruction of 3 talismans of Vol, ancient weapons of the Old Ones that had once been used to battle the Void Dragon itself. Free Deceiver shards have appeared on Neogeddon and Gladius, in gathering followers and even creating new servants in mockery of their ancient role as gods. The World Shaper, Igrania, broke free on Damnos and powered an entire floating Necron city before the Ultramarines managed to free it from its Tesseract vault. When released, the shard's scream literally cracked the earth beneath it, demonstrating even in its diminished state the terrifying power it once wielded. It took a vortex grenade, sucking the shard into the warp, that realm it so despised, to finally end its rampage. But even then, it was not destroyed, merely banished to a dimension where it could not affect the material universe. And therein lies perhaps the most terrifying truth about the Citan. They cannot truly die, not in any permanent sense. Even when Landugor the Flayer was completely obliterated, yet his essence remained potent enough to curse the entire Necron race. The shards that were sucked into the warp or scattered into distant corners of the galaxy are not gone. They endure, waiting for an opportunity to return or reunite. Each transcendent shard calls to its lesser fragments, attempting to draw them together. If enough shards of a single Citan were to merge, the resulting entity would approach the power of the original star god. And that entity would remember everything done to it, would recall the betrayal of the Necrons, the humiliation of imprisonment, the agony of being shattered and scattered. The reunification of even a single Citan would be a catastrophe on par with the worst moments of the war in heaven. These beings are gods in the truest sense, entities whose very existence warps reality around them. A whole Satan could extinguish stars with a thought, reshape planets like clay, age entire populations to dust in moments. They would be driven by 60 million years of imprisonment and rage, seeking vengeance against the Necrons who betrayed them and hungering to resume the red harvests that had sustained them in the ancient past. And unlike the younger Chaos gods who are sustained by the warp, the Satan draw their power from the material universe itself. They cannot be banished with prayer or psychic might. They must be fought with weapons and strategy, contained through technology and eternal vigilance. The current state of the galaxy, broken and burning as it is, provides the perfect environment for Satan shards to operate with relative freedom. The Great Rift has split the Imperium in two, drawing attention and resources away from threats like rogue Satan fragments. The Necrons themselves are divided, with different dynasties pursuing competing goals, and some actively working to free Satan shards for use as weapons, despite the obvious dangers. Trazyn the Infinite is rumored to possess several powerful shards in his museum galleries on Solemnes, keeping them as curiosities alongside his countless other artifacts. The Silent King himself powers his dais of dominion with a captured shard of Niadrazatha, using the Burning One's essence to fuel his war machine, even as he works to unite the Necron dynasties. The terrible irony is that the Necrons cannot abandon the Satan entirely. The shards are too useful, too powerful to simply lock away and forget. A single Satan shard can turn the tide of an entire campaign, breaking fortresses that would otherwise require months to siege, annihilating armies that would cost thousands of Necron warriors to defeat through conventional means. And so the Necrons continue to use them, always aware that they're playing with forces that nearly destroyed their entire species once before. It's a calculated risk, one that every overlord must weigh when deciding whether to deploy their imprisoned gods. But perhaps the greatest danger the Satan represent is not their physical power or reality-warping abilities. It's what they symbolize, what they teach us about the nature of the universe in which the 41st millennium exists. The Satan are proof that godhood is not only possible, but that gods can be cruel, capricious, and utterly uncaring about mortal concerns. They demonstrate that the universe is fundamentally hostile to life, that even beings born from the very moment of creation view organic existence as nothing more than food to be consumed. They show us that betrayal can come from the most unexpected sources, that salvation offered by powerful benefactors may be a trap more terrible than any enemy's blade. The Necrons learned this lesson at terrible cost. They sought immortality and received it in a form that made them wish for death. They reached for the stars and found gods who devoured those same stars. They begged for help from beings they didn't understand and became slaves to masters who saw them as either tools or meals. Every warning ever given about being careful what you wish for is embodied in the story of the Necrons and the Satan. And that story is not over, as it continues in every tomb world that awakens, in every shard that breaks free, in every desperate gambit by a Necron overlord who thinks they can control powers that predated intelligent life itself. The Satan shaped the galaxy in ways that still echo across the millennia. The Eldar fear death because the Nightbringer imprinted that terror upon their species' collective unconscious. The Adeptus Mechanicus may worship technology because a dragon dreams beneath their holiest world. Entire star systems remain lifeless because the Satan drained them during the war in heaven, turning fertile worlds into barren rocks orbiting cold, dead suns. The very fabric of reality in some regions bears scars from battles fought between star gods, places where the laws of physics don't quite work right, where time flows strangely and matter behaves in impossible ways. These beings are the oldest intelligences in the galaxy. They watched the first stars ignite and will likely witness the last ones fade. They have consumed civilizations beyond counting. have seen empires rise and fall like mayflies, have forgotten more than most species will ever know. And they are still here, broken but not gone, imprisoned but not powerless, waiting in the darkness for an opportunity to resume what they began 60 million years ago. The feast was interrupted. The red harvests were halted. But the hunger never faded. This is what makes the Satan so terrifying. They are patient in ways that immortal machines can only begin to understand. A shard might wait 10,000 years for a specific set of circumstances to align, for a particular dynasty to weaken, but for a prison's bindings to degrade just enough to allow escape. They do not grow old or tired. They do not forget their grudges or abandon their goals. They simply wait and plan and hunger, secure in the knowledge that they have more time than any mortal mind can comprehend. And when the opportunity comes, when the stars align and the moment is right, they will emerge from their prisons and their hiding places, ready to teach the galaxy once more what it means to be prey to gods born from the Big Bang itself. So we must ask ourselves, what happens when the Satan truly return? Not as scattered shards wielded as weapons by Necron dynasties, but as whole entities, reunited and aware, and filled with 60 million years of rage. What happens when the void dragon beneath Mars finally breaks its chains? When the outsider, mad and terrible, emerges from its self-imposed exile at the galaxy's edge? When enough Nightbringer shards merge to recreate something approaching the original Death God? The answers to these questions are the stuff of nightmares, scenarios that would make the Horus Heresy look like a minor border skirmish, and the Tyrannid invasion seem like a manageable threat. Because here's the fundamental truth that keeps those who understand awake at night. The Satan won once. They defeated the Old Ones, the most advanced and powerful species the galaxy had ever known. They would have consumed all life in the Milky Way, if not for their own internecine conflict and the Necrons' betrayal. And they did all of this while still learning to use their powers, still figuring out what it meant to be conscious and individual. Imagine what they could accomplish now, with millions of years of experience, with knowledge of their enemies' capabilities, with hatred to fuel their purpose and hunger to drive their actions. Imagine the Satan unchained, unbroken, united in their desire to finish what they started in those ancient days before humanity's ancestors had crawled from Earth's oceans. This is the legacy of the Satan. This is the shadow they cast across the galaxy, not the shadow of their current diminished state, but the shadow of what they were and what they might become again. Every Tesseract vault is a potential catastrophe waiting to happen. Every tomb world that awakens might unleash forces it cannot control. Every shard that escapes is another step toward an apocalypse that would make the fall of the Eldar look like a minor inconvenience. The Satan are the galaxy's original sin, and the price paid for reaching too far and grasping at powers beyond mortal comprehension. And they are still hungry. After 60 million years of imprisonment and fragmentation, after being shattered and scattered across the stars, they remain fundamentally what they always were: devourers. The stars are not enough. Mortal life tastes sweeter, richer, more satisfying than any stellar fire. The fear and pain and desperation of sapient beings is a delicacy they have never forgotten, a craving that no amount of time can diminish. When they dream in their prisons and hiding places, they dream of the red harvests, of worlds screaming in terror as the star gods descend to feed. They dream of the time when they were worshipped as gods and feared as destroyers, or when their names were spoken in whispers and their passing left entire civilizations as nothing but ash and memory. The galaxy has moved on since the war in heaven. New empires have risen. New species have claimed dominance. New gods have emerged from the warp to challenge the material realm. But beneath all of this, like a current in the ocean's depths, the Satan endure. They are the foundation upon which much of the galaxy's current horror is built. They are the proof that the universe is hostile. that gods exist and care nothing for mortals, that power comes with terrible prices and salvation offered by the desperate is often damnation in disguise. They are the oldest beings in the Milky Way, and they will likely outlast every species currently fighting for survival in this grim darkness where there is only war. So when you look up at the stars, remember, some of them are feeding grounds for entities that predate your species, your homeworld, your entire evolutionary lineage. Some of them house shards of gods that were old when the universe was young, and somewhere, in the depths of space, or locked in tesseract prisons, or sleeping beneath Mars itself, those gods are dreaming of the day when they can resume their feast. Dreaming of the day when the galaxy learns once more to fear the C'tan. And that day may be closer than anyone realizes, because in the grim darkness of the far future, even the oldest beings can find new opportunities. Even shattered gods can scheme and plan. Even the imprisoned can dream of freedom. The C'tan have been patient for 60 million years. They can wait a little longer. After all, what is another millennium or two when you have existed since the beginning of time itself? What is the brief candle flame of human civilization to beings who have witnessed the birth and death of stars beyond counting? Nothing. We are nothing to them. Just another species, another civilization, another feast waiting to be consumed when the time is right. This is the truth the Necrons learned too late. This is the horror that awaits anyone foolish enough to think they can bargain with gods or control powers beyond their understanding. The C'tan are coming. Not today, perhaps, not tomorrow, but inevitably, inexorably, they are coming. And when they do, the galaxy will burn as it did in those ancient days, in the time before memory. In the age when star gods walked between the worlds and life itself was nothing but fuel for their eternal hunger. This is the legacy of the C'tan. This is their promise and their threat. They are the oldest beings in Warhammer 40,000, and they fully intend to ensure they are also the last. If you enjoyed this deep dive into the lore of the C'tan and the ancient horrors that still haunt the Warhammer 40,000 galaxy, please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. It really helps me continue creating this content for you all. And if there are other aspects of 40k lore you'd like me to explore in this style, let me know in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and remember, the stars are watching back.
I hope you guys enjoyed the story. Make sure to hit the subscribe, like, share button, whatever you want. Give me some feedback if there's any, and yeah, sleep well.